Every unprecedented crisis creates unprecedented opportunities. At the moment, there are many restrictions to our gatherings, travel, and the normal rhythms and routines of our everyday lives. I want to encourage you not to see the current limitations, but to see the unique possibilities. Rather than focus on what we can't do, let's focus on what we could do. This is an unparalleled opportunity to think outside the box, to think creatively, to think unconventionally, and to think innovatively. Let's reflect on this with a short biblical devotion. In 2 Kings 4 verses 1 to 7, we meet a woman in dire circumstances. Her husband, one of Elisha's company of prophets, had died. And although he revered the Lord, he left an unpaid debt. The creditors were coming to take her sons into slavery for payment for the liability. Without the presence of her sons, she would be unprotected, meaning that this widow was in grave danger of not only losing her family, but her possessions and security. So out of desperation, she called out to Yahweh's representative, Elisha, for assistance. And if we find ourselves like this bereaved woman in tough, restrictive circumstances, through no fault of our own, let's also call out to the Lord for divine help. Surprisingly, Elisha didn't just want her to see a problem, but asked her to see the possibilities. He asked her in verse 2, "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" It was like Elisha was asking, what opportunities do you already have? She possessed only a small amount of oil, and astonishingly, this little portion of oil was all that the Lord would require to do something extraordinary. Elisha then instructed her to go around and ask all her neighbors for empty jars. But, he added, don't just ask for a few. Essentially, he instructed her to seize the opportunity by preparing for a miracle as best she could. And she was instructed not to think small, for he said, don't just ask for a few, because this may potentially limit what God was about to do in her life. She was urged to respond in faith and prepare for bountiful provision from the Lord. One of the principles we learn from Elisha's words is that we have to see the opportunities we already have within our grasp. Let's not be overcome by our lack of resources or suffocated by the limitations of our current lockdown, but actively respond to the Lord's prompting and guidance. For example, one of our World Outreach Ministries, Siam Care, which is based in Thailand, recently learned that nurses in the local hospital didn't have enough protective gear against being infected from COVID-19 from patients. And because the virus usually enters people through their eyes, nose and mouth, the Siam Care team decided to make them face shields. And the medical staff were just overwhelmed with thankfulness. They seized the opportunity. Elisha then instructed this lady to go inside and shut the door behind her and her sons. In other words, she was to go into lockdown, self-isolation, and prepare for a miracle. And she was told to pour the little oil that she had into all the empty jars, and as each one was filled, to put it across to the side. And as she obeyed the prophet's word, in lockdown, the oil miraculously kept flowing until every empty vessel was filled. It was only when the jars ran out that the oil stopped flowing. And even though you're in lockdown, what empty vessels can you pour into? But, by way of example, I was speaking with a retired missionary couple last week. They're in lockdown in their home country, but actively doing Bible studies on a social media platform and recording messages which are being broadcast across the world through internet radio. They're having an astonishing response from many parts of the world, including many closed countries. They're pouring the little oil they have into empty jars across the world. This dear widow obeyed the word of the Lord through Elisha and reaped a miraculous harvest. And after telling Elisha what had happened, she was told to sell the oil, pay her debts, and live off the surplus. So, not only was this lady's debt paid, but she was able to sustain her family without the need for another loan, which would have only continued the cycle of debt. The Lord not only met her immediate needs, but set her future up. In the most unlikely and unexpected circumstances, the Lord provided a miracle by taking the little that she could offer and multiplying it all. And it all happened in lockdown.